So, as far as you know, are there any differences between the stereo discs and the mono discs of the Beatles' White Album?
In terms of the actual sound, yeah, there's a significant difference.
And what are some of those?
Well, looking at the history of the mono version and just what I've read, and also since I own a copy, although I really shouldn't say that too loudly because the mono version was never officially released in the United States, so the version I have is from a different source.
Okay.
A number of the songs stand out in sharp contrast to some of the stereo counterparts, particularly Helter Skelter, particularly Piggies and Blackbird, also While My Guitar Gently Weeps. There are sounds and noticeable sound differences and effects, and also the speed is a little different.
And this is disc 1. Can I take this out?
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Oh, we'll take, like, say, Helter Skelter. How does Helter Skelter differ between the mono version and the stereo version?
Helter Skelter has, thinking of the song now, has less echo. It has a somewhat different drum track. A lot of the sound effects are missing from the mono version as compared to the stereo version. And also, the ending that you find on the stereo version is truncated on the mono version. You don't have a fade in and a fade out, a fade out and then a fade back in. So there's a little segment that's missing.
Yeah, it looks like an album that they would put out, or a CD that they would put out with the words and stuff. Whether or not this wasn't put out when they made the album, obviously, because CDs weren't around, so it's either redigitalized or some kind of new thing newer thing. This does look kind of oldish, though. I mean, not very recent, just because of the. And even this one just looks dingier. Maybe that could be because of the plastic itself.
Okay.
Looks older. That's also.
Okay.
It's possible that these CD cases are just. They may not have been the original ones that the CDs actually came in.
So why are there all these differences between the two versions? Why are they? Why was one recorded mono and one recorded in stereo?
Typically, even up until 1968, stereo systems were not in every household, and even in 1968. And stereo was just starting to make its headway as the acceptable or sought-after mix. But up until that time, people who had stereo system, I can't even call them stereo systems, who had record players or turntables in their home, they weren't hi-fi. The mono mix was the preferred mix because of the sound that would come out of those systems. And then once I keep calling them stereo systems. We take it for granted now because now they're stereo everywhere. Vitrolas. But at that time, around 1968, 1969, and really gaining ground in 1970, systems were really able to handle high fidelity and separation, channel separation. And so stereo mixes suddenly became more sought after, and mono mixes became less and less in demand. And so the mono mixes just started fading into oblivion, and a lot of engineers around this time just started mixing everything in stereo.
Now, were you a Beatle fan at all growing up, or?
I mean, I knew who they were, obviously, and did some songs and stuff, but I just never really got into. I mean, so, I know some of their stuff, and I know some of the words, but didn't really listen to them much as a kid.
How old were you when the White Album came out in 1960?
I wasn't born yet.
You weren't born yet?
Yeah, I was 2 years later, and actually I was born roughly a couple of weeks before Paul McCartney filed suit in the London High Court, and the dissolution of the Beatles started.
So how did you acquire this knowledge? Like, I mean, you seem to have fairly extensive knowledge of this. What's some of the processes that you've gone by to acquire this knowledge over time?
A lot of reading. I've been a Beatle fan since I was about 5. I heard my first Beatles song. My older brother actually got me into that frame set. Actually, the first music I ever heard was the Beatles.
Did you ever have any like mentors or anybody you met who knew a lot about the Beatles who helped you, or has this been like kind of a
No,
your own self?
it's been pretty much a hobby. It's been my own. I know my brother, my other older brother, who's 3 years older than I am. Not the same brother who introduced me to the Beatles music. You know, we lived together for a period of time in the same house, and so he was also a huge Beatle fan. So we kind of exchanged a lot of, you know, there was a lot of discussion between the two of us on these same books because he read them. And when, you know, again, we got that foundation, we just started looking at all the things that were, because the Beatles are the most, oh gosh, documented entertainment act in history.
So would you consider yourself an expert on the Beatles in general?
I don't think so, really. I'm what you would call a historian, because I know there are plenty of them. Like I said, Nicholas Schaffner is one. Philip Norman is another one. But even then, I have to ask, you know, an expert in what area, because if you look at the Beatles, you can study pretty much any aspect of their career, and you could become an expert in one thing.
So what do you mean by that? Just go into that maybe just a little bit more.
You can become an expert in their early days. There are books written just on the origins of the Beatles and the Hamburg days and the development of them, you know, their sound and the Mercy sound and where that all evolved. There are people who have written on just Sgt. Pepper and looking at the Summer of Love and the Beatles' influence on ushering in that era. Somebody who I really like and admire, and what really got me into the music, so to speak, and really looking closely at the music, since it was that first grabbed me, was Mark Lewison and the Beatles recording sessions. You know, Paul McCartney called that the Bible of the Beatles recordings. So you can just look at the recordings themselves, which Lewison has done. I don't really think there's such a thing as a Beatle expert per se in terms of knowing everything about them, because I definitely don't know like Paul McCartney's favorite color, and even knowing birth dates is hard. And there are people that just like to look at that, you know, the factual stuff. A lot of those books are everywhere.